Well, here we are, and I have actually been fortunate enough to capture Quentin, and he's joining us. We've just been passing the time waiting to go on air, talking about our days in Moscow, as his days were much more exciting than mine. Without more ado, what do you make of the present situation, Quentin, with Putin and his so-called ceasefire with the Ukrainians?
It's quite extraordinary, as so many events are at this time. I mean, it really is a new world, and sometimes very difficult to fathom what's really going on. I think what's happening is that Vladimir Putin is showing his complete self-confidence in the present situation. He says he's setting up direct talks with Ukraine, and then can't be bothered to go himself, and sends a very junior delegation. I think he's not serious about wanting any form of ceasefire or any form of peace. I think he feels that time is with him and Trump is with him, and he's not going to lose.
And do you think that Trump is tending back towards Putin?
I think Trump has been effectively attracted and tempted by the friendship of Vladimir Putin from the start. I think Trump is all about power politics, and he's decided for himself that Putin is a power politician, and Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine represents a weak country. He's not interested in weak countries. He's only interested in doing deals with strong people. So I think his inclination is actually to back Putin. I'm very pessimistic about the situation. Not that I think that the Ukrainians are actually losing on the ground, but I think that Putin is convinced that history is with him, and eventually the great Russian Empire will be recreated by bringing Ukraine back under the control and under the umbrella of Russia itself.
And is anybody convinced by the move of Europeans towards militarization again?
Well, not very much must be the answer. I think the Europeans have realized that after all these years of depending so much on the American security shield, that they are actually going to take really quite a long time, a matter of, I would say, years, before they can really reassure their own defense, or at least, they've got a long way to go, and they are, as we know, quite divided in themselves. There's divisions between the minority like Hungary and Slovakia and so on, of rather pro-Russian member states who constantly block the others from being more united. So it's a very difficult situation where the Europeans have hugely depended on NATO up to now with the American security shield, and have not had a serious defense aspect to the European Union. And in all of this, where is Britain? Relying on NATO, which Donald Trump seems to be determined to weaken, and actually we've sort of chosen the wrong side to be on, so to speak. I think it's a real dilemma.
Where do you think that this is going to play out in the short term?
Very muddled. I mean, the trouble is trying to predict how Donald Trump is going to jump at any one of these moments. You know that there's a NATO summit coming up in the summer. Donald Trump is going to be attending, and yet he hates these sort of events. He hates summits because they're not totally focused on him. It's like his reaction to why Putin is not attending these Russia-Ukraine talks. His instant reaction, as you may well have seen, is, "Oh, I knew he wouldn't go because I wasn't going. He would only have gone if I went."
Yes.
So it is absolutely extraordinary trying to predict how will Donald Trump react?
Mm.
I think it's a mug's game. We're going to have to play this almost month by month. It's a very dangerous situation.
Yeah. Do you think that Trump is a scattergun type chap? I mean, has he got any strategy, or is he very, very clever and keeps everybody on the back foot?
Yeah, I think it's much more that he's always inclined to be unpredictable, but he is, I think, instinctively unpredictable. I mean, I was talking to somebody who's worked with him a few times the other day, who says, I mean, this is a man who refuses to go to any meeting with an agenda. He won't follow an agenda if he's given one. He doesn't do any homework on the advanced briefings that his officials might give him. And so when you go into negotiations with him, it's really you're using the seat of your pants, because you just don't know which way he's going to jump. He wants to be flattered. He wants to know that he is the center of your attention, that you're going to do almost anything to please him. And yet at the end of the day, I don't think he's an ideologist. I don't think he has an ideology, and I don't think he has a clear strategy. He just wants respect. He's very much like a sort of mafia boss. It's all about respect.
Yes. Now, let's turn to your intimate knowledge of Muscovites and the middle class parts of Russia, because it is suggested that one of the things that is holding back Putin from going full tilt into Ukraine with armed forces is that the middle Russia won't tolerate a war. What's your view?
Well, that was certainly the case when I was in Moscow, which was entirely during the years of perestroika. I was there till about 6 months before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it was an extraordinary time where the backlash that we saw against the war in Afghanistan was very real. The mothers of Russia uniting to say, we don't want to lose any more of our boys in Afghanistan. Now we have perhaps an even stronger, as you say, sort of middle class in Russia, people who've got a stake in greater prosperity, essentially very much the urban elite. We're talking Moscow and St. Petersburg rather than right out in the old deep Russia. But nonetheless, there clearly is an attitude which says, why are we losing all our sons and indeed daughters in a war that doesn't seem to be going anywhere? So I think there may be a hesitancy there. I think that Putin puts on a pretty good facade of self-confidence when he presents himself in public. We saw the way he behaved at the VE Day demonstrations in Moscow the other day. He looked to be very relaxed, joking away with Xi Jinping and so on. And yet he's not this is a man who is fundamentally quite insecure in the way he behaves, because he as you may well know, whenever he travels or goes out of the country, he always used to take his own chef with him. Like the Tsars in the old days, he was always worried somebody might poison his food. So that's one aspect that I think he's worried about. The other one is this extraordinary sight that we see of him negotiating with people at opposite ends of an enormous table. This was a man who was terrified during the days of COVID and so on of catching some sort of infection or being contaminated with COVID. So I think he is a really funny mixture. I was talking about Trump just now as being a mafia boss. I think Putin is another mafia boss. It's all about getting respect and really being a power hungry man, but a ruthless one. I think more ruthless than Trump. I think the relationship is between two mafia bosses, but Putin is the one who is a killer. Trump is just a rent collector.
Now, as a mafia boss, mafia bosses are always subject to takeover, violent takeover. Where does Putin stand in terms of his confidence in being able to maintain leadership in Russia?
Well, he certainly seems to have been pretty successful at surrounding himself with loyalists and very much reinforced the old structures of the KGB, now the FSB. So it is once more the sort of security-run state that it was before perestroika. I mean, for me, as somebody who lived through those extraordinary years of Gorbachev in Moscow, it is an absolutely tragic situation where we're back to the years where you really didn't know who you were talking to or didn't know who you could trust. You constantly were looking over your shoulder to see who you'd be, who's following you or who's listening to you. Now, obviously, as a foreigner in Moscow, and I was a foreign journalist in Moscow, we were very much being watched all the time. But as perestroika went on, it all relaxed more and more. And then into the Yeltsin years in the 1990s, the atmosphere was much more relaxed, but the economy was much more chaotic. And I think that's what really, in the end, brought Putin to power. He's reimposed that security system of the worst old days of the Soviet Union. And I would be, I think, horrified if I was able to get back into Russia now at the way, the atmosphere I would find. All my Russian friends appear to have left the country. They're either living in the Baltic republics or in Georgia, or indeed in Europe or in America. And it's awful. I don't have any friends on the ground in Moscow any longer.
Well, I have some tomatoes to protect because I've got friends who are in their dacha on the Moscow River, have a greenhouse, and half the tomatoes in the greenhouse are mine and half are his.
I think it may be a little while before you collect them.
Yeah, absolutely. But the once again, using the term middle classes, people who are reasonably well off now, okay, so it's 10 years since I've been in Moscow, but they seem to be very optimistic about the way that the country was going. Do you think that that's changed?
It's really difficult to read because clearly those who are supporting the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and the fact that this is, reasserting Russian nationalism, obviously represent a very significant part of the population. At the same time, those sort of people who believed that actually the country was going to be much more like a westernized free market economy with people able to speak their minds, I fear that a lot of those, the younger generation, are those who've been leaving the country. And there has been an awful brain drain, really, of some of the brightest and best of the younger generation, which is another tragedy for Russia, a bit like after the revolution back in 1917, when so many Russians left the country and really left the country without a new generation of bright young leadership. So I think that it's a country which, when I left in 1991, I said to myself, it's going to be at least 2 generations, maybe 50 years, before Russia is a normal country again. Well, the truth is, I think that I may have been over-optimistic.
Right. Now, are you worried by the present situation?
Yes, I'm very worried because, one, you've got a highly unpredictable president of the United States, and it's his unpredictability which worries me more than the decisions he's taking. The decisions he makes he can reverse without blinking, like his policy on trade tariffs and so on, which he seems to introduce, scream from the mountaintop, and then suddenly just drop and forget about, or at least park. And so he's thoroughly unpredictable. And as for the man he's talking to in Moscow, or the man he clearly wants to talk to in Moscow, Vladimir Putin, he's a man who wants to recreate the Russia of old, the Russian Empire of old. He wants to turn the clock back. So here are two leaders who actually, I think Trump, who wants to turn back America to the sort of 1950s America he grew up in, and Putin, who also thinks that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So he wants to somehow reimpose that. And the rest of us, I think, you remember that wonderful poem by W.B. Yeats, "The best lack all conviction and the worst are filled with a passionate intensity." I worry that the rest of us are losing our conviction and our confidence in the liberal democratic order that we set up after the Second World War, in multilateralism, in the United Nations as being the peacemaker in the world. I mean, the United Nations is looking so much weaker than it used to be. And one of the last jobs I did as foreign editor of the FT was travel around the Middle East with Kofi Annan when he was Secretary General of the United Nations. And he was attempting to forge a peace between Israel and Lebanon. Israel at the time had invaded southern Lebanon. And he flew from country to country trying to forge that peace. Where is the United Nations now in trying to forge peace in the Middle East? The only person we've got wandering around the Middle East is Donald Trump trying to sign up commercial deals and property deals with the leaders of the Gulf and let the Israelis get on as really giving them a free rein to do whatever they like in Gaza.
Why do you think that two strong men start to come out of the woodwork when other institutions and organizations and countries, for that matter, start to sap their strength?
Do you think there's a pattern to history? Are we reverting to another world order? I'm not sure. I think the problem is that we've gone through a series of really major upheavals and we're still coming to terms with them. Just to off the top of my head, one, you had the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was entirely justified because the Soviet Union was a complete mess when Gorbachev came to power and was trying to sort of reform it. It was sort of unreformable. So that was the first great drama. But the second, and just as important, the dramatic rise of China. The third, hugely important, was the transformation of our technology so that we now can talk to each other down the line and see each other wherever we're sitting over the internet and have this absolute outpouring of information, good and bad, over the internet. So all of these dramatic things, and then in the middle of it all, the financial crisis that we saw in 2008, when so much of the new financing of this new technological world actually sort of collapsed overnight, and finally the pandemic with COVID. Now, these are all huge international developments, and I think that they make everybody very nervous and tend to look inwards and backwards. Can we recreate the nation state? We need strong leadership. We no longer trust this multinational world order, the world order of the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization. And people are saying, no, we want more nationalism. We're turning back. And we're seeing it not just with Trump, not just with Putin and Xi, but also with the rise of far-right populists across Europe. All of them basically saying, oh, the problem is foreigners. And I think this is a very worrying, but not necessarily permanent shift in view. My hope is that actually it'll go badly wrong, because I think, rogues like Putin and Trump will fall out, and they'll realize that a world of strong men squabbling is actually a much more dangerous world than of weaker leadership where everybody tries to do things by consensus.
Right.
I think we'll come back to that.
Let's just turn to, you mentioned China. I know very little about the Far East, and the Chinese seem to me to have created a worrying reputation, very strong and economically savvy, but then suggestions that perhaps some of it is a facade. What's your view of the Chinese element in this whole scenario?
I think that China is a mixture of both a very dramatic and admirable economic performance, quite extraordinary, and a country with, of course, an amazing history and culture going back so far, but one that this adoption of a sort of utterly flawed and highly centralized Communist Party model is thoroughly dangerous. And what I was talking about in terms of what Putin is recreating in Russia, the security-based state where everybody is watching each other and everybody is, quite ready to denounce their friends and neighbors and family in a situation where nobody can trust each other. That's a really dangerous side to it. So I'm very torn. I think what we are seeing is the decline of American hegemony and the rise of Chinese hegemony. And I think that is a process that, if I had to put hard money on it, I would probably think the rise of China is an inevitable counterpart to the decline of America.
Is China going to get militant?
Well, the only thing that the Chinese I know insist on is that China is really only obsessed by its own backyard. Now, its own backyard is bigger than is comfortable. They want to bring Taiwan back into the fold. They totally want to dominate Tibet. They treat the Uyghur people in northwest China as second-class citizens and put them into prison camps and so on. So within its own immediate area, China can be ruthless and pretty difficult to deal with. What they insist is they're not trying to conquer the world. Now, one has to wait and see, because certainly the way that they are acting, for example, in Africa, where they are the new colonialists, but ones who are exploiting the fact that the old colonialists, like the British, like the French, like indeed the Americans, have left not a very good reputation. So I think that my African friends would certainly like to give the Chinese credit for actually spending money in Africa.
Quentin, you're a new boy on the block, and very, very experienced, and very knowledgeable of the areas that you're talking about. I've just been giving you a scattergun. What if? Have you got something that you would say, now this is what we've really got to keep our eye on?
Well, I feel passionately that the multinational process and the multinational system that we set up in the years immediately before I was born, and I'm old enough, born in 1948, but what was set up then in terms of the international institutions and a benign liberal democratic order with a relatively benign hegemon in the case of the United States, that was a world order that has actually been remarkably good for us all. And it would be tragic to throw it out or to abandon it. The danger is that it did require, as what I said, a benign hegemon in the United States to actually live with it all. Now I think the important thing is that the Europeans may have to pick up the pieces and try and be the true believers in multinationalism, the ones who would actually keep these institutions going if the Americans turn their back on it. Because what one's seeing, I think, in Trump is a man who is really only interested seriously in his own backyard. That's why he's talking about Canada, Mexico, Greenland, Panama as his real interests. He wants to take over more countries in his own backyard. And he's really not interested in Europe at all. He actually thoroughly dislikes what he sees in the European Union, because that's exactly what he doesn't want America to be, a slow-moving, consensual, and fundamentally rather benign part of the world. So I still believe in the world order that we created after 1945, and I think the great tragedy would be to allow these mafia bosses, if you like, to take over and try and divide it up themselves. We mustn't lose confidence in the order that we've created. Part of that, of course, was Britain turning its back on the European Union, which was, to me, still a complete tragedy, and one that I hope eventually we will realise was a terrible mistake.
Yeah. Is the present situation starting to turn out stronger European leaders, do you think? Or are we going through an uncertain period?
Well, it is a fairly uncertain period. I know Friedrich Merz a bit, who's just taken over as German Chancellor, a passionate pro-European, also an Atlanticist, but I think more of a pro-European than an Atlanticist. He seems to have come out saying pretty much what I've been saying: Europe has got to stand on its own feet, because we can no longer rely on a Trump-led America to bail us out. And I think he's absolutely right. The question is, he's not a particularly easy man, and his start as Chancellor has already had shown it was a bit bumpy. As for France, very important how Emmanuel Macron behaves. He also has made some pretty foolish mistakes, really, in calling those elections last year and suddenly seeing that you know, the centre in France has lost its majority. So the parties of the centre all across Europe seem to be in retreat, whether it's Germany, whether it's the Netherlands, whether it's France, or indeed Italy, and now in Britain. Labour and the Conservatives look as if they're on the back feet again too. So we've got to, if you like, revive our belief in the good, solid centre ground and not allow the extremes of left and right to take over our countries.
Is the centre ground actually losing its credibility, though? I mean, the Conservatives buggered it, and it looks as if Labour has not filled the gap. We've got Farage as, if you like, the extreme party. Mind you, I hesitate to actually call him that at this particular stage, but that traditional politics seems to have actually watered itself down.
Yeah, I think the key word, Keith, I think, is trust. I think that the centre ground has lost the trust of electors. Do you know, I think possibly the most dramatic and tragic moment in terms of losing our trust in this country, in the centre ground of politics, was that series of exposés of members of parliament fiddling their expenses.
Yes.
It was a nightmare. My own father was actually a member of parliament way back in the 1960s and 1970s, and his expenses you could have put into a very small brown envelope. They never had much and they weren't paid very much, but he didn't fiddle his expenses. He just took what little they gave him. Now, suddenly to discover that everybody seemed to be on the take, I think was a disaster for the political establishment. And we saw it in spades with somebody like Boris Johnson, who had no regard for playing by the rules when he was Tory party leader and prime minister. That really undermined confidence in the Conservative Party and will prove to have been one of the greatest tragedies for a party that always regarded itself as the natural party of power.
Yes. Quentin, it's been a fascinating 3/4 of an hour. You're going to join us once every couple of weeks or so, is that correct?
Well, we'll see how it goes, provided life doesn't get too stressed and too dramatic on other fronts. But I will do my best, and I will do my best to tune in and not to be too dismal and gloomy.
I mean, the nice thing is that Mirador is beginning to increase its what should I say, quality, and you're a wonderful addition. So I'm quite keen to keep you in the fold, as it were. But based on what we've talked about today, quite rightly so, because these are the sort of things that the average man in the street does not think much about. He has a knee-jerk reaction to things, but he doesn't really think too much about what's happening and how it's developing and what's likely to happen. So I'm very keen that you keep us up to date. And things are happening at such a remarkable rate of knots. As you say, Trump does not believe in kicking his heels. That keeping people up to date is quite important, I think. So I'm delighted that you're with us, and we'll look forward to having you on fairly regularly.
Very good, Keith. And I clearly have to invest in one thing, which is a very smart hat.
Indeed.
It's good. Until we meet again, and maybe I'll have a better hat.
Right, you are. You're on.
Sure.
Thanks, Quentin.
Right, all the best.
Well, there we are. Quentin Peel, the latest man that, and unfortunately, Stewart couldn't join us, but nonetheless, we had a good trot through what's happening in the world, and we most certainly need to stay on top of that. Okie doke. We'll say toodle pip, and we'll see you tomorrow for our jamboree. There we go. Toodles.
Thank you.